Okay, good morning. Thank you all for joining us today for our April legislative coffee, and wanted to thank first off Senator Tyson and Representatives Jones and Finch for being with us this morning. A couple announcements before we get started. First off, I want to thank our sponsors for the event this morning, Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee, who organizes and plans all of these events, the Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, American Legion Post 60, and AT&T have helped sponsor these events this year and many years prior. Many of you have been to these before, but just a couple reviews on how we'll work this morning. First off, the coffee is being recorded for TV, so when you have a question or speaking, please talk into the mics so we can pick up the recording for television. When you have a question, let me know. I'll walk the mic around and I'll keep the mic, so no offense if I don't hand it to you, but I'm going to hold on to it just so we can help pace the day and make sure we get everyone's questions answered. But you're allowed to answer or ask one question. Please make the question direct to the representatives and abstain from making statements. We really just we're here all to ask questions and get answers from our representatives today. If you haven't done so already, please turn off your cell phone so we don't have any distractions or interruptions with the recordings. My name is Ryan Henningsen. I'll be your moderator this morning. Refreshments this morning in the back were provided by the Democratic Central Committee, so thank you very much for providing those treats. Thank you to the City of Ottawa for hosting us this morning, and thank you to the staff for being here to run and record our meeting. So, that said, let's get started. So good morning to you all. I thought maybe we could start, since we've now had first adjournment in session, and just maybe give us a few minutes summary from each of you on what you've seen accomplished, things you've been talking about, things you've been working on, and I'll just start with you, Kevin.
I appreciate it, and appreciate you being here, given the flip-flopping in the weather right now. I got out of my car this morning and went, oh my gosh, it's cold. But I appreciate you being here and being up on issues, and thank you again to the sponsors also. That said, to get a kind of a overall, and I've been asked this a lot lately, like an overall feel of how the legislature has went. Go back to really the first coffee, and even before that, when we were being asked by media, what's going to be the focus of this session, and truly for myself and everything, and everybody in the legislature, everything has been pivoted on the K through 12 funding, and that's basically what it came down to at the final minutes before first adjournment too. It all comes down to the K through 12 funding, and so that's been the major push and the major focus all year long. The question, and with all of it, I kind of go back to an amendment that was made by our tax chair on the House side, Chairman Johnson, and he brought the amendment for the current funding, the House position funding for the K through 12, and he did it in committee. When he did that, he did it with reservation, if you will. I would suggest that Chairman Johnson probably has the best understanding of taxes and where our tax position is, and some of the things that he said in committee were. It's going to be pushing the line to be able to do the funding at even a compromised level of 500 plus million over progressively over 5 years. It's going to be a real hard push to do that without a tax increase. And so he mentioned that he said that in committee, and that's keeping the current position we have without. And adding internet sales tax with the hope there's not really some solid stuff or some solid policy or numbers there. And so with those in place, he was really kind of skeptical. So, but that said, it did pass the House. It went to the Senate. The Senate took a position early on, which I actually thought was smart. It had to do with the constitutional amendment to get us out of the cycle of litigation. And then they backed off and came with a lower number. Ultimately, they came together with the House on a position that was the House's numbers, and ultimately that passed. and that went to the governor's desk. So that's kind of where that's at with and as we know, there are some mistakes made, and it's $80 to $90 million short, and so At the very end, right now, we agreed in the House to a resolution. We might get into that a little bit. We agreed to a resolution that gives us about 8 days in veto to finish our work, and then doesn't give us any veto power or anything at the very end because it's set so close. So we kind of gave up some power and position when it comes to our what I believe is our duty as the House side. But anyway, that's kind of where things are laying right now, and that really does give a whole gist of the legislative session and where it's at. So,
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Senator Tyson, do you want to
Sure.
take a couple minutes?
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. It's a little light crowd today. We were debating whether it was other events or the weather. And my guess is the weather, but it's good to see you guys came out. It's been an interesting session. Mainly one of the focuses, besides K through 12 education, has been tax. For those of you that aren't aware, the federal government cut income tax in December 2017. If we do not have Kansas legislation, then you most likely will have a tax increase if you itemize on your taxes. Because currently, if you cannot itemize on your Kansas return unless you itemize on your federal return. So we're trying to separate that to allow individuals the choice of itemizing on their state return. Also, one of the things that the tax committee in the Senate has worked on, and we were able to get past the last day of session, was a bill that would allow deductions to accelerate. Right now, this year, they would be at 50% for your medical, property tax, and mortgage interest. And we wanted to accelerate that in the Senate so that you could start taking those deductions this year. They should have been implemented when the tax increase went in. They were not. It was a graduated stair step, 50% this year, 75% next year, and in 2020, it would be 100%. So we just accelerated that and moved it up. There's other items that need to be dealt with also on tax that the Senate passed out. We're hoping the House will deal with. Everybody has a different opinion, but it's anticipated that if we do not pass tax legislation this year, it will stop taxpayer money going to your pocket and instead increase Kansas government by approximately $137 million. The number, that's what we were told in February by the Department of Revenue. But I was told on the phone last week that number could be as high as $300 million, depending on whose figures you use. That's one thing that we get used to. It's disappointing and difficult to do your jobs at times, but they are estimates, and we've never seen it, and I've talked to individuals that have been up there over 20 and 30 years. They said they've never seen what happened with the tax bill that we had. We get fiscal notes with our bills, and they give an estimate about how much that bill is going to cost the state government. This fiscal note, we were given the numbers in February, like I said, but they would not include those numbers in the fiscal note for the bill that we carried across the floor. So it was intriguing. Not sure why it happened, but it looks like politics. Believe it or not, politics in Topeka. But we did get the bill passed. The other issue was school funding. It was a major issue. The Senate did have a different position. I did not support the Senate position, and I did not support the House position. There were several reasons. One of the items in the bill would do cortisol testing for preschool individuals. I thought this is an extreme change in policy for Kansas. And so we need to take a hard look at that before we start passing such legislation. But it would require cortisol tests for preschools. And there were other items in the bill that, we need to take a deep look. We've got an opportunity here as legislators to address K through 12 funding in our school policy and we need to take advantage of that. And so I know there was a lot of debate, a lot of work. There were some other good things in it, but to me, the bad far outweighed the good in voting for that legislation.
Representative Finch.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see that bipartisanship is still alive. We have the Democratic Central Committee feeding 3 Republicans in the crowd today, so that's a good thing. It's a good sign that all things are not amiss in our democracy. It was a very interesting last week of the regular session. It's probably felt like 3 weeks crammed into one for those of us who were there. And for some of you who were watching, it probably felt a little bit like the national news cycle where every time you turned around there was a new story with something else going on in Topeka. So looking forward to unpacking all of those issues with you this morning through your questions and talking about them. Everything from the constitutional amendment to the school funding bill, which was the predominant issue for the last week of the session. I think I was, of the 3 of us, I was the only one who voted for the funding bill as it came through. My primary reason for that is we are under a court order. We had an April 30 deadline to respond with briefing to the court's decision in the Gannon 5 case. The Attorney General and the House's counsel were telling us you need to do something before you go home. If we had gone home for a 3-week break, we won't go back until April 26th. That would have put us there 4 days before the briefing deadline. It would have been very difficult to make an argument to the court that we were moving towards compliance with their order if we hadn't passed a bill. The funding amount in the House bill was more than I really wanted to vote for. I think the Senate version was probably a little low, but the reality is, you have to go where you can get 63 and 21 and get it on the governor's desk, and that's kind of what happened in this case. There are always in a piece of legislation of that size, there are things that you don't like, things that you would like to see different, but the reality is it's not just one person's decision. So there is an error in the bill that has to do with an amendment. It's called the Arndt Amendment, and basically what it says is that every school district in the state levies at least 15% LOB, local option budget, meaning they take a percentage of their budget and they can use local property taxes to add money to their budget. The state equalizes that, right? Because a mill and property tax here is not the same as a mill and property tax in Blue Valley. And so there's an equalization that goes along with that. What the Arndt Amendment says is since everybody is levying at least 15% local option budget, that money should really count when the Supreme Court looks at how much total funding is contributed towards K through 12 education in this state. In many states, that's the case. It's a match of both local and state effort to conclude whether or not they've reached a threshold of adequacy in funding. And so that's what the Arndt Amendment says. Now, the problem is the formula is so complicated that when you make a change here, there's a ripple effect through the formula, and there can be some unintended consequences. And that's what's happened. There's about 2 factors that are pushing dollars this way and another factor that are pushing dollars this way, and that $80 million error is really 3 different components that add up to about $65 million, not 80. But it makes a much better news soundbite if we say there's an $80 million error. And then people run around and act like the sky is falling and like we never ever go back and do a trailer bill in Topeka to fix things. So we will get it worked out. We will get it fixed. And that's what we do. And I think every one of us here is committed to making sure we get the deal that we thought we were getting, if only because that means a big difference to our local districts. And I have the numbers here for the Franklin County districts on what the difference would be if the error is not fixed. So we can go through those, but I want to make sure we get to all your questions, and thank you all for coming out this morning.
Okay, so we'll open it up to questions. Who would like to start? Who has the first question? Okay.
I'm going to politely request that I be allowed to ask kind of a multi-part question because it requires some foundation. Is House Resolution 5209 likely to make it to ballot? That's the first. That's a yes or no question. If so, can you guarantee that it will not be on a primary ballot? And if not, explain why something so important to our state's children would deny all independents from expressing their will in this matter. Now, I did discuss this with Senator Tyson, and she let me know that they would be on a ballot for independents, but that would be the only thing that would be on the ballot. My concern is there would be nothing other than that to get independents out to vote. So I would still like your thoughts on that matter. And probably this is mostly for you, Blaine, but the others can answer if they choose to.
Sure. HCR 5029 is the constitutional amendment resolution that came out of the House Judiciary Committee earlier the last week of session. So I think it came out on Wednesday. The provision in there right now calls for it to be on the November ballot, which is what I've have supported every time we've talked about constitutional amendments. I believe they need to be on the widest possible the highest possible turnout and get the widest possible number of people to come and weigh in on it. It does have a provision that says a special election could be called on that issue if the state wanted to do that. That, again, would be open to everyone, and I think that's where Senator Tyson is saying if it were on the ballot, it's going to be on a ballot where everyone can vote on it. The cost of doing it at a special election is fairly cost prohibitive, and I don't see that happening. I really think if it goes forward, it gets on the November ballot, and that's where you'll see it. And that's, in my opinion, that's where all constitutional amendments should be. That's where they traditionally have been.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I didn't say it would be the only thing on the ballot. It would be possibly the only thing for an independent ballot. There could be other local issues or local candidates that are independent that could be on the ballot also. But yes, they would have an opportunity to vote, so thank you for asking.
And all I can really add is you had asked if I thought it would get out of the House or would it actually get to before the people. I would love for it to get out, but I'm kind of hesitant to believe that it'll actually get there. The reason I say that is because I really feel like we should have done that prior to anything else. I think that it's been dragging its feet for so many years. It's been something that I've really wanted, and then and now we have the opportunity to really put it forward, and it just hadn't. So I'm hesitant to believe it'll actually get out, but these guys might have a different view on that. I would love to see it get out. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. Got another? Okay. However you feel comfortable.
Okay, John Holland, and it looks like we're a little slow on questions, and all of my brothers and sisters have left the state, and I'm the only one left, and I'm trying to explain to them what's going on in the state of Kansas. So I'm trying, because of the diversity of my family's political makeup, I'm trying to keep straight with the facts. So I came up with kind of a factual timeline to try and explain to them what's happening, and I thought maybe it would be helpful to other people too, kind of like if we laid it all out. And that was basically that in the 1960s, the state of Kansas passed a constitutional amendment to prioritize education, especially K through 12, as a priority, and to basically make sure that the state government, legislature, governor, everybody was aligned and accountable to making sure that that was a priority. And then, basically since then, we've had a numerous number of state of cases brought against the state, and pretty much every one of those cases has been found for the plaintiffs. In other words, the state legislature and governor have basically failed in the eyes of the courts to basically meet the requirements, and so therefore the amendment has led to people being allowed to help the state government adjust things to get it right. Then basically with the recent findings, the state legislature had its own contractors come in, and they reaffirmed the latest court finding about funding for the education, and they basically found that let's see, $500 million is what we need to keep things where it's at, but if we want to move into the 21st century, we need to find $1.8 to $2.0 billion. So then, at the same time, you're also wrestling with the fact that we're short of funds for states' roadways, universities, prisons, state mental hospitals, pretty much all of the state institutions that the state is required to maintain to serve the people of Kansas.
John, I need you to ask a question.
So basically, I guess the question is, am I getting this pretty much correct as far as the facts are concerned?
No. In 1965, in the wake of World War II, there was an effort to modernize the Kansas, Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution. Article 6 has always concerned education in the state of Kansas. And in the wake of World War II, across the country, there was an attempt to modernize and professionalize the educational system. In Kansas in 1965, they called together a group of 11 prominent citizens to study Article 6 of the Constitution. They recommended a complete rewrite of the article, basically a gut and go of Article 6 of the Constitution. They came back in December of 1965 and submitted that recommendation to the legislature. Now, what's interesting is that the funding provision, which is 6.6b, Article 6, Section 6, subsection B, was completely different as recommended by that 11-member panel and legislative leadership when they submitted that to the legislature. Somewhere along the way, 6.6b got completely rewritten to what we have today. And I'll just tell you, here's what it used to say, or was supposed to say. It was supposed to say, the legislature may make provision for finance of educational and scientific activity by transfer of funds or appropriations, creation of special corporate entities, pooling of public and private funds, any other method not prohibited by the Constitution. It was a provision of permission for how the legislature may make provision for education. Of course, what it was changed to is what we have today. The legislature shall make suitable provision for finance of the educational interests of the state. Nobody knows where that came from. There is zero legislative history about why that was completely changed. We simply don't know. Further, we really don't know what it meant at the time because the way it's interpreted today goes through a Kentucky Supreme Court case with the Rose factors, right? The Rose case wasn't decided until 20 plus years after Article 6 was added to the Kansas Constitution. We simply don't know what was intended. The second thing you said, that over and over there have been cases and the governor and the legislature have failed. Actually, that's not true. Up until 2005, all of the cases said we were doing just fine. 1992, the USD 229 case came about. Blue Valley basically sued the state over the new funding formula. The court, that was the first case that went above the district court level, by the way. They had all been resolved at the district court level prior to that. That one went up on appeal, and the court said, the formula's fine. We think it's okay. And as to the question of whether or not the state is spending enough money, that's really a political question that the court shouldn't decide. That's up to the legislature, the people's representatives, to decide how much gets spent on education. 12 years later, in 2005, the Montoy case came about, and it was decided, and Montoy went completely the opposite direction and said not only is it not a political question, it's a question the court should weigh in on, and we'll tell you exactly how much you need to spend to be adequate. So for 13 years, we've wrestled with both Montoy and, in its wake, the Gannon case, which was filed before Sam Brownback was ever governor and before the tax cuts of 2012. It was filed after there was a reduction in funding as part of the Montoy Agreement in 08 and 09 in the wake of the Great Recession when the state just didn't have the money. And so we've been in litigation for most of the last 13 years when the court has taken an abrupt turn and said, no, it's not the legislature's prerogative to decide this, which is what everyone understood it to be up until 2005. So it is not a history of 50 years of the legislature and governor failing to do its job. It's quite the opposite. As to the study came in from Dr. Taylor, and she recommended 1.8 to 2.1 billion based on whatever performance benchmarks we wanted. And those were primarily graduation rates, moving from either 90% or 95% graduation rates. Something that's worth noting is that the national average for graduation rates is a little over 80%. The best in the nation is 91%. Nobody gets 95%. And Kansas is right at about 85%. So we're 5 points better than average. We're 5 points less than the best. But we're a long way from a goal that nobody has yet obtained, a 95% graduation rate. Kansas doesn't have $1.8 to $2.1 billion to put towards anything, whether its priority is K-12 or not. We just don't have it. The state general fund's about $6.5 billion. So you would have to expand it by 33% in order to get $2 billion to put into K-12. That assumes that you're wrapping in the CAPERS increases, because we know that a lot of that will go to salaries, and that will ultimately increase our pension liabilities. So the study also, I think, had some flawed methodology. I think it created and talked about what really should be an aspirational goal, but not one that realistically we can afford to meet. We can all think about it in our private lives. There are things we'd like to have, whether it's that sports car that you've dreamed about since you were a kid, or a new addition you want to put on the house. These are all worthy things that you might want, but the reality is the budget doesn't support that level. And our budget doesn't support that level to try to do something that literally no other state in the union has done. And another thing about funding studies, and then I'll turn it over to someone else. There have been, between 2003 and 2014, there were 39 school funding studies done across the United States. 38 of 39 recommended more money, a lot more money. The only one that didn't was a touch-up to a study that had done previously that recommended more money. So almost 100% of the studies recommend that states spend more money. It doesn't matter how much they're spending at the time. 85 to 87% of those states don't put in the money recommended by the studies. Kansas is not unique in that regard. The difference here is that you have a court system saying you have to fund to the level of the study. That's what Montoy was. That's what Gannon is. They used the Augenblick and Myers study from 2001 and the legislative post-audit study from 2006. And now we'll see if they use the Lori Taylor study that nobody in the legislature, to my knowledge, has signed off on and said we think it's ideal. But we have to fund to the level, or it's perceived that we're not adequately funding education in Kansas. But I want you to understand that is by far the national trend. Studies done and says put in a lot more money. State doesn't put in that much money, and they go on down the road. Here we get litigation, and then we ultimately have to try to fund to whatever level the study came up with.
Ditto. Very well said. I'll add to that too. We have schools, there's 4 to 5 schools we found out through study that are saving, they're taking $5 per student and putting it in a savings account for the next lawsuit. They don't even know what they're going to be suing about yet, but they're saving for the next lawsuit. We're in a vicious cycle in Kansas, and we need to address it.
One other thing, just real quick, on the Lori Taylor study, if you actually look at the tables in that study, if you fully fund her study, there's about 5 districts that get $1 billion of that $2 billion, and there are several districts that get cut, including Ottawa. Ottawa would get less money if you fully funded the $2 billion, because her theory is if you're doing a good job, we can take money from you and we'll give it to districts where they need it. So that's what happens if you fully fund the Taylor study, the way she wants it implemented.
And I appreciate having Chairman of Judiciary here, because they have they've heard that the constitutional member, the HCR 5209, and so Representative Finch has given that history to us. I think I've heard it 3 times now, and appreciate it so very much, because there's a lot of that we just nobody understands. You know, we if you go back and look at it, you go, what? How did this happen? And the idea that it came in and nobody has that history for suitable that's a scary place. But all of that said, having sat on K through 12 budget in the House and heard Lori Taylor and what they brought forward, and then when she mentioned the 95%. You start thinking back and going, oh, well, this was actually a goal that Kansas Can, it's part of the Kansas Can initiative. And when it originally came to us, it was just simply, we know it was termed or defined as this is a shot at the moon, but we would like to be at this level, right? Well, 95%, as Chairman Finch said, that's a huge, when you set your goal, you have to set something that's high, but you also have to set something that's attainable. And so that's what, when we try and explain putting $2 billion in, even then, the sustainability of it at $2 billion would be very, very difficult to get 95%, because we have, there's special ed, there's all kinds of different entities and factors that come into play. when it comes to the actual graduation rates that would make it virtually impossible. So it's a very high goal that I don't think was ever intended necessarily to be, hey, if you want 95%, put $2 billion in and you'll get there. I don't know that it is. Now, we just came from a district that has 95% graduation rate, but across our state it fluctuates. That next year, and we all know, even on my own school board, we'll have a grade that's really good. I mean, they're really high, great graduation rate. You're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And then the next year you have a grade that's dealing with different issues, whatever it may be, and they're a lot lower. And so as it averages out, it's a very difficult thing to get that high. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. And before I get over there, John, just we appreciate everyone's attendance here and your time, and appreciate your time to be here to answer questions for the group and for our broadcast. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but please remember, let's keep comments to a minimum and ask your question for the benefit of the group so we can get their feedback on what they're doing in Topeka. So, John, I'll walk over here and get you next.
Thanks. I'm John Cohen with the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm specifically asking about Senate Bill 331, which at least at one time it was Senate Bill 331, which is naming the Flint Hills Trail or moving that into the state park system, and that would be very beneficial to Ottawa and Franklin County. And Mayor Skidmore and I actually were in Topeka this week talking at Wildlife and Parks about some of the advantages that we could gain from that being from that bill happening. And I know it's stalled, and I don't know exactly where or what the problem is, but could one or all of you address where that is and how we might get that going to get that to Governor Collier this year?
Well, I know that bill passed the Senate. I don't know where it's stalled at. I haven't been watching it.
According to the website, and I know we voted, the conference committee has been approved in the House. We're waiting on the Senate to approve the conference committee report. Once that's done, it'll go to the governor's desk. So there's one more vote, and then it's on to the governor's desk. Passed 96 to 23 in the House on April 6th. And because it's in a Senate bill, John, as you know, they have to end up in their House of origin, so the Senate will get the last vote on it.
When I say it's in trouble, I'm just kind of quoting what Secretary Jemison said when we were up there. So I don't know what the trouble was. He really didn't describe it. But
I mean, everything was in trouble as of 11:59 Saturday night.
Yeah.
I think we're past that.
Yeah, yeah. And for those of you that don't know, we came within 2 minutes of losing every single bill that had not passed and been sent to the governor's office. And actually, I'll get into a little bit of it. It was kind of interesting. We passed an adjournment resolution every even-numbered year that allows us to go past a few days past the 90-day session. Well, the Senate passed it, but we amended it, so it wasn't the original one that had been agreed upon. So we sent it over to the House. Well, the House didn't like it, so they sent their version back, and it was a game of chicken between leadership, and it was really intimidating to some of us. I didn't think it was a good tactical move, but it was being played, and the risk was losing every single bill that had not gone to the governors. And we were within 2 minutes. The House made the motion to accept the resolution, to vote on the resolution to adjourn. But what was interesting is it takes 2/3 votes in both chambers to pass that resolution. If anybody would have called division or roll call vote, that resolution would have failed in the House. They did not have 2/3 of their members on the floor at the time they voted for it. But nobody did, and we made it through. But talk about, we ran into a lobbyist the next morning out for breakfast, and they said it was a new level of low for Topeka. That's a sad statement for our legislature and for our leadership. I hope that we will work together, like you said, with the cookies and both bodies, and come up for solutions. The Senate had, and I was asked when I first got here, the Senate shut down debate in the middle of that evening. We were on the tax bill, and we had a call to question to shut down debate. We've had that twice since I've been in the Senate. I voted no on it both times. The first time was the Republicans trying to shut down the Democrat debate. The second time it was the Democrats shutting down the Republican debate. And the third time, the same night, it was leadership trying to shut down the debate. You should never be afraid of the debate. Never.
Okay, Tom?
Yeah, two quick questions. Back to education. Have you done any studies about the keeping up with the inflation as far as the school funding has gone? Has it drifted lower than the CPI over the years? And then the next question, maybe is a sacred cow that I'm going to put an arrow in, but whenever we have a bond issue for facilities, it's always said, you know, the state's going to pay for X number of it or a certain portion of it, and maybe the number I remember is like 67% or so of the new facilities, which we've really taken advantage of several times in Ottawa, and we're thankful for that. But when it comes to funding teachers and education, is there ever any discussion about changing that to where we vote locally and use local tax dollars if we need a new gym or we need a new school or we need this and that about education, but the state puts their money into teachers' salaries, education, quality of education, and those kind of things. So I never hear that discussed about the transfer of funds from the facility support to the education support, and then how much really is spent on buildings and facilities on a yearly basis. Thank you.
Well, actually, the House, the Senate did pass legislation in 2016 that would have dealt with that issue as far as the facilities. Right now, we are currently, as a state, $6 billion in debt for school bonding. $6 billion. It's a staggering number. So in 2016, the Senate did take steps to address that issue. One was to put it on a rolling 6-year rolling average. I thought it should have been a 10-year or 15-year, but we did pass a 6-year rolling average for that to deal with it. And the other thing is that the locals can always vote to support those facilities. They do not have to have state funding matches. They can do that on their own, and the state money can go to the classroom and to the teachers. We have attempted, and I've said this several times, but we have attempted to pass legislation that requires 65% of the funding get to the classroom and the teachers. 65% as a mandate. We can't even pass that number. We can get past that 65% is a goal, but not mandated to the classrooms and the teacher. So we absolutely need to make sure the money's getting where it needs to.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom, for the question, and actually, really good question. On the CPI, the inflation, there's studies that are done yearly, I believe they're done, and keeping up with the CPI has been an argument used when it comes to how much we put in. It's not enough. Answering the courts, and that's the current argument right now, is that it doesn't keep up with inflation. So it should be more money. Which we've kind of discussed, like that we can't do. I mean, we can, but it's going to require increases in tax and stuff like that. So yeah, that's done every year. I don't have numbers right with me when it comes to that, but I definitely know that that's something. On the bond issue, this is, and I believe that the Senate position actually had some caps in there. I don't know what happened back and forth. The one thing at the school board level that we really want is predictability, but at the state level we want predictability too. And that's that the bonding, as Senator Tyson said, if you don't have some type of predictability and 10 school districts bond out and we match, it just becomes almost impossible to kind of gauge how much it's going to be each time. And so the idea of having like a cap or a predictable means to understand, okay, this year it's going to be $300 million in the bond world. And I know it does help districts. I don't know that the incentive is necessarily good, but your question on actually, and maybe I need clarification, but actually taking the state money and maybe giving it down to the school districts and then they use it to match, is that what your question was? Because I don't know that discussion has been had.
No, my question is the funds, obviously, that every year there's schools being built and every year the state is funding some portion of that, usually. And so I'm thinking maybe do away with that funding for facilities and use that money that would go into payment of a bond on that school, some way to take that portion of the state's funds and put it directly into the classroom or the teachers and capers and all of that stuff, rather than the facilities, and let the facilities be paid for totally locally, not have the option of state funding of facilities.
Yeah.
You want to respond further?
Well, I was just going to say, actually, what there is moves to actually do that. There's goals, people state goals, getting as much to the classroom as possible. It's the trouble is kind of taking one against the other. It would be the difficult piece there to actually get facilities and actually take that and put it in. I like the idea. Yeah.
Try to take them in order. You asked about inflation and whether or not we were keeping up with inflation. That is part of the House bill, is to go back kind of that end of Montoy era, so 08, 09, and kind of catch that up with inflation, and that's how the $522 million figure came to be arrived at in terms of that. In the course of the hearing on HCR 5029, representatives from the Kansas Association of School Boards testified to us, and one of the interesting stats that they gave is that between, I think it's 94 and present, if it's not 94, it's 98 and present, so the last 20 or 25 years, education spending on K-12 as a percentage of state general fund dollars has remained constant, between 49% and 51% over that whole period. Now, obviously the state general fund has grown through that period and gone up, and so education funding has gone up, but it has remained fairly constant at about half of our state budget gets spent on K-12, which is, as most of us would say it should be, right? Education is a priority in Kansas, has been since the days of the Wyandotte Constitution, and we support schools, teachers, and educating our children. But if the House bill, if we fix it, and the measure that passed, we get the $80 million back in it, and that goes forward, we're going to see education, K-12 spending as a percentage of SGF go up to about 57 to 58%. And that will be the first time that it's been that high. So that is a sea change, because remember, there's already $290 million more going into K-12 in fiscal year 19 from the actions we took last year, and then as you grow up to that $522 million over 5 years, it's going to be over $800 million new dollars put into K-12 in a $6.5 billion budget. So it will increase that percentage significantly. Bond and interest, there is a provision in the bill that caps the state's portion of bond and interest reimbursement. And between 2011 and present, the state's match for bond and interest has gone from $50 million a year to $200 million a year. It's increased fourfold in the span of about 5 years. This would cap it at $175 million, and just like what our cities and counties deal with, where they have a bonding cap that you can't levy new bonds unless you're underneath that cap. So that's one of the new provisions. Doing what you've suggested and basically saying the state's going to get out of the facilities matching game, we're not going to do any of it, I think would probably raise an equity issue with the courts, simply because the value of that mill and property tax is so much less in our small rural areas like West Franklin or Central Heights than it would be even in Ottawa or Lawrence or Johnson County, so that you'd have this, basically what we have now but on steroids, this arms race of facilities. And I invite any of you, go to a Frontier League game in DeSoto and look at that gym. It's magnificent. And then you go to Central Heights or West Franklin and look at the facilities that they're dealing with. And that's with a system that's somewhat equalized. If you completely disequalize it, I think the smaller schools are going to have zero chance of ever having, and not just athletic facilities, but academic facilities as well, having those kinds of classrooms and lab facilities and the things that we say we want to prepare our kids for education in the 21st century and beyond.
Appreciate your interest.
Yep.
Hi, Diana Starr-Sinek-Dean. I just want to make sure that I understand the CAPERS funding. Is that part of the education budget? And if so, has it always been part of the education budget, or has that changed over time?
Good question. So remember, we talked earlier about kind of the history of litigation and how the courts have made different interpretations at different times. There's now 5 different Gannon opinions, and I think it was 2 or 3 where the court said, well, you should count all the money. So you should count capers too. So the state's portion of capers that it pays for teachers and school administrators and staff should be included in what we spend and what's counted towards adequacy under the Constitution. In other words, have we made suitable provision, right? And so it should be counted in that calculation. For every $200 million that we increase K-12 funding, there's an additional $20 million that has to be spent on capers. So should be counted and are counted are kind of 2 different concepts, though, and that's the problem. Even if you count the state's contribution to capers on behalf of all education personnel, we should be well within that range that the court identified, but we're not given full credit for that. So it is an issue. The other thing I'll tell you is that with the bill going forward, the $522 million over 5 years, that does not include making the state's third capers payment, about $190 million. So we are going to backtrack a little bit on the progress we had made. In the last 6 years or so, we've gone from about 54% funding of capers to about 65, 66%. We've actually lowered our unfunded balance in capers, and we will see that start to recede a little bit as we have to put more money towards K-12 over the next 3 or 4 years, and don't have as much money to catch up those capers payments.
Yeah, Mike Skidmore. Just staying with the K through 12 questions here, and Senator Tyson addressed it partially there, but the 65% of it going to the classroom, that's a goal. I've heard between 65 and 75 as a goal. First part of my question, where are we now on that percent? And the second question is, I understand our state districts have close to $900 million in reserves, and there's been some talk to spend that down. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I'm not sure where we're at on the 65% because of the way we do the books. It's very difficult to tell what we're spending on extracurricular activities in the schools, the breakdown. So it would be nice to get to that number. Another question I've asked too is how many superintendents came from the athletic department? I'd be curious to know. Not saying anything, I know most of my superintendents did, but it just shows that might be their priority over other items going on in the school. And we just need to be cautious. We need to get the money to the classroom and to the teachers. That should be our priority, education. I'm very proud of my Kansas education. I wouldn't have had some of the jobs that I've had, working at NASA and other jobs. And we need to focus on the education. We can bring those technical jobs to Kansas. We have just excellent schools. And why we are not tapping into that to be a resource for telecommuting, for other jobs, and bringing companies here is beyond me. I know we've got Garmin here. That's a prime example of how good we can be. We just need to do that. The other question that you asked was,
I won't touch it, I promise. Not like the previous guy did here. The $900 million, I understand the school district have in reserve across the state.
And how we feel about that?
Down if we did how.
Yeah, I have mixed emotions on that. We're going to penalize people that have been trying to save money, but then the schools that are just socking it away for no reason at all or for a lawsuit, we need to look at that. That's a large amount of money, and I've asked the question too: is how is that money being invested? Because that we all know that it could be sitting in a savings account or it could be invested in some way to be making more money. So we really need to look at how we're funding our schools, how we're managing the money, the full picture.
I guess I will remain seated, though. Almeida Edwards, and I have a question regarding the rail trails. What is the benefit, and I know Robin Jennison, he used to be a friend of mine when I was more active in organizations. How is the legislation of changing this to state parks thing, how does that benefit the people out in the agricultural community who struggle with rail trails as far as fencing, being able to cross with their equipment, the entrances to roads, vandalism, et cetera, et cetera?
I can speak to it a little bit. And I actually voted against that. I have some folks down in the Osawatomie area that are very, very passionate about this, being right along the rails and trails. And with the history of it, many of them believe that land should have went back to the landowners. Farm Bureau, different folks like that, or different groups like that, believe that very, very passionately. And I do too. That said, there's this understanding, because I went straight to my landowners. I went to the Farm Bureau. I went to the KLA. I was just asking folks. I was like, okay, where do you stand on this? Because the government kind of taking over is better in the way that they can bring down some federal grants. There's watching the trails, being able to guard the trails or police the trails. They can do better, basically, in it than it is in its current state with the current group that's doing it. Not to say that they're doing a bad job, it's just even they would agree it would be helpful. Now, I know they were trying to name it after Secretary Jennison, too. I know, it's kind of a joke. But the thing is that it actually would be better in that capacity. That said, though, I stood with the landowners down in that area. I really feel like, and I had both sides come to me, even to my home, and talk to me about it. I wanted to get the full kind of understanding of the whole thing, and there's this understanding that those trails most likely will never go back, and with that, it would be better to be kind of pulled in by the government. So,
Well, I just wanted to make the comment that as a member of the chamber, see, I'm conflicted. We have an absolutely unique situation here with the crossing over on the west side here, and so I can understand that. And it's hard when you can understand both sides of something.
yeah.
I'm Noble Carter, and what I want to know, what can you do to stop the courts from raising the school money? It seems to me like the legislature should be in charge of that. They absolutely.
I think, and that's kind of the thing we all wrestle with in Topeka, and that's one of the reasons you saw this group come together, the Coalition for Fair Funding, which is the Kansas Farm Bureau and Kansas Livestock Association, the Kansas Contractors Association, and introduce a draft that ultimately became this HCR 5029, a constitutional amendment. You know, our system is one of checks and balances, and there are things that the court reviews what the legislature does and has the authority to say what the law is. That goes back to Marbury versus Madison in 1803. But there's also a check and balance on the courts. When the courts interpret the law incorrectly, you go back to the legislature and you change the law so it's clearer. And I can tell you, as someone who works in the corrections and juvenile justice and judiciary area, every single year we have a series of bills from the Attorney General, from law enforcement agencies, from prosecutors, saying we think the court got this wrong, we need to change the law so it's clearer about what the legislature intended. This is no different. If you believe that the court has now moved into an era where they're interpreting this provision of the Constitution in a way that is not what was intended, then you look at a constitutional amendment, you put the issue before the voters and let them tell you, yeah, we do think the legislature ought to make this decision, or no, we like it just the way it is, and we'll abide by whatever the will of the majority is. But it's not for the legislature to say, this is what the Constitution's going to say now. It's for the public. It's for the people to decide what their Constitution will say. But I think for those who are turning up the rhetoric and saying that somehow that's trying to short-circuit the process or to be unfair, I think that's incorrect. I think asking the people to weigh in after 50 years on whether this is truly what they intended, given that the last 15 years have been completely different than the 35 before it, I think that's an appropriate question to ask the public in the state of Kansas and let the people weigh in.
You know, our courts have been overstepping. In fact, our Kansas Supreme Court has been overturned, I think, more than any other state Supreme Court in the nation. That's a statement there. Our courts are legislating from the bench. There is nothing in our state constitution that says a dollar amount or says that the courts will decide a dollar amount. It says that the legislature has the power of the purse, and we need to take that back. And I agree that a constitutional amendment, I'll vote for it. I'm going to support it because it allows us as voters to decide whether we want to continue this cycle of lawsuits or whether we want to get it in check. It doesn't say that you can't ever sue again. It just says that the legislature, it firms up the language that the legislature decides the finances for the schools. And that's the way it should be.
And to answer your question, you can not retain a judge, you can impeach a judge, or you can do the constitutional amendment. And really, our best chance is a constitutional amendment. Send it to the people, if we can get it to the people, to make that actual vote.
The other thing I would add about the draft, and I encourage you all to go look at it online. It's changed from what was introduced. It's much simpler and easier to understand now, in my opinion. It doesn't even mention the courts. But one of the things that's in there is, for the first time, it says that suitable provision includes adequacy and equity. Equity is not in our Constitution. And if a different court is on the bench 10, 15 years from now, made up of justices from Johnson County and Sedgwick County, and they decide equity doesn't really matter, we really don't care, we're not going to look into that anymore, you could well see rural schools be in for a really, really tough time as the representatives and senators increase in the urban areas, and you could have a court saying, we're not going to monitor. If Johnson County wants to go out and tax themselves to build palaces to education, that's fine, they can do it, and they don't have to equalize and share that money with the rest of the state. And there is no constitutional protection right now on equity, and so the amendment would actually put equity into the Constitution where it is not now.
Okay, we're coming in just under 5 minutes. I know we have a couple questions here, so we'll try to get them.
Make it as brief as I can. A lot of questions about finances were addressed today, and my question is kind of in that same realm. As you talk about capers and being able to continue to fund that, and we're lowering that standard down, is there any concern at the legislative level now, when you start to look at the bigger picture, that the state's probably looking at another bond downgrade because of this and where we're headed?
You guys want to start with that one?
Go ahead.
I think that I don't know that we'll see a bond downgrade. Structurally, we're in a better place than we were over the previous 4 or 5 years, but absolutely to believe that we are not going to be in tight fiscal constraints for the next 5 years. I expect that if the court accepts the bill that's going to be sent to it, I suspect that they will retain jurisdiction of the case for the next 5 years until the plan is fully paid for. And so, unlike the last 4 or 5 years where we could make adjustments to the tax rate in different ways, and we did. In 2015, there were changes to sales tax, ones that we didn't necessarily like, but they were made. And then there were changes to income tax last year. You don't have that luxury when you're under court supervision and jurisdiction on the school funding piece. You will pay it. It will be the first dollars out of the state budget. And so everything else will have to see limitations or cuts in order to fund that, because it is a zero-sum game when you're talking about the Kansas state budget. It has to balance. And so we will definitely see, I think, lesser service delivery in all of those other critical areas. I'm hopeful that it won't be a bond downgrade, because I think we'll be able to just squeak by, but it'll be another 5, 6 years of what you've seen for the last 5 or 6, just for a different reason.
What's interesting is with those massive tax increases in 2015 and 2017, revenue estimates are actually up this year, over $275 million year to date. So, and what's almost all the departments and agencies see that number, and they come asking for an increase in their budgets. And so that's what's gone on this year. It sounds all gloom and doom with the money, but really we're in better shape than what we have been in making these decisions. It's just that K through 12 right now is taking the wind out of everything else in the state. And I want to thank you guys for coming out today, and thank you for your questions. It's always good to hear what's on your mind.
And I appreciate the question. With the bond downgrade, and the reason that we are doing where we're at with Capers is because of the bonding that we did a few years ago. I think it was $1 billion. And I wasn't necessarily for that in the first place. I'm not real big on bonding out to make those payments and all that kind of stuff. Make yourself look better a little bit in the eyes of creditors and whatnot. But it really is going to fall on what we do right now in the omnibus and bringing everything together for this year is going to tell a lot. If we're responsible, then it should be fine. If we're reckless, then we're going to see, at least a consideration of a downgrade, and we'll see what goes from there. And governor plays into that. Everything plays into that. Again, I want to thank you also for coming in, for the sponsors for sure. So,
One last question.
You all know I'm doing my homework with this question. Judy Davis Cole, I represent AARP Kansas, and the question is about Medicaid expansion and what happened to the telemedicine bill.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh.
the telemedicine, super important. It's hitting heads with like Kansans for Life and the abortion issue, because the issue, there's some language in there that some would rather just take out, some would rather have in. What it comes down to is down the line, if you could do abortions using telemedicine, that would be a bad thing, according to some people. So that's where it's hit a road. I think that in 8 days, that we'll see it again, but we'll see. I know it's important. I know it needs to get out there. So
it's critical. The telemedicine bill did have pro-life legislation in it, and it needed to match up to other legislation that we have in statute. Otherwise, we would have a similar situation that we have with the Cox-Kettler. I was able to get an amendment on a gun bill that cleared up the language. We had ambiguous language in our statute, and it allowed the judges to pick or choose one place or the other. And so we do not need that in the telehealth medicine bill either. And that bill is important to rural Kansas and to all Kansans. And for those of you that don't know what the bill was, real quickly, what it would do is if you had telemedicine, internet, or phone call medicine, you could charge your insurance company. Your insurance company would be obligated to pay a doctor's visit or office call.
I suspect we'll see the telemedicine bill back, and it will get done. I think there's far too many people interested in it and who want it. And obviously, for those of us who have rural areas in our district, we know how critical it is to have access to health care for people for whom it may not be easy to get to a doctor or a hospital. And this is literally a life-saving measure, and requiring insurance companies to cover it is important. So I think we'll see that come back. On Medicaid expansion, I think the Hospital Association, which was kind of the big push behind it last year, has said it's not going to happen this year. They don't expect it to happen this year. And to the extent they've not even tried to sit down with folks and say, how do we change the law a little bit? How do we develop a compromise so we can get those other votes that we need? I think they've kind of backed off of it this year. And given what we've talked about for an hour now about the financial constraints on the state, that makes it doubly hard to say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and engage in any new program that's going to have year-over-year increase in costs. So my hope is that they will sit down with some of us who think there's a way to do this and truly make it budget neutral, and see if we can't come back next year and talk about something like that.
Well, thank you again to all of you for being here. We know you all have families, and appreciate the time away on a Saturday to be here to answer our questions and give us some feedback on what's happening in Topeka. And thank you to you all that were here this morning. You're a fantastic group, and good questions, good participation. We really appreciate you coming out. And I just want to say thank you to our sponsors again one last time. The cookies were, again, provided by the Democratic Central Committee, City of Ottawa for hosting us in their facilities and recording and broadcasting this, the Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce, Franklin County Farm Bureau, American Legion Post 60, and AT&T. So thank you again for being here. Have a great Saturday.
Thank you all.